Welcome, everyone. My name is Julia Toothaker, and I am the career coach and strategist behind Ride the Tide Collective, the podcast, and the company. This is a career-focused podcast that helps ambitious professionals strategize and take action to control their career in a way that aligns with their personality and their values. This season, I am embracing the collective part of my company name, and I have invited on various coaches and experts to talk about topics that impact career development and career decisions. And I'm very excited for this topic today because I feel like this is a topic that impacts so much of our career and we don't even realize it. And we are going to be talking about the relationship between food and burnout and your career and being a high achiever and what that looks like. And my guest today is Ahuva Hershkop, and she is the mother of three. She's a registered dietitian and coach for high achieving women ready to step back from the brink of burnout and start creating a life that they love without compromising on their professional goals. Yes, this is absolutely what we are looking for here. I think what you're going to be talking about aligns so perfectly with my audience. Ahuva is the founder of ARM Yourself, ARM Yourself
Dietetics.
Dietetics. Whoa. Okay. Let me say that again. Ahuva is the founder of ARM Yourself Dietetics, a pediatric-based nutrition practice in Toronto, Canada. I love when we get people from other countries as well. I'm based in the US, and so this has been really fun to just have a more international perspective as well. And she is focused on raising intuitive eaters and the unapologetic living code, her 12-week coaching program for high achievers. She empowers women to foster the self-trust and confidence necessary to create a working and home life that lights them up instead of burning them out. Yes. Finally gives themselves permission to enjoy instead of just doing it all. Oh my gosh, Ahuva, I'm so happy that you are here because I feel like just from that intro, I'm like, yes, we are so aligned on everything.
You're like, we're done the podcast. That's it.
This was the episode, just your intro. Just believe all of that. Yes, we are ready to go. But thank you so much for being on and being a guest. I'm so excited for this conversation today.
I'm so excited to be here.
Yes. Okay. We are just going to jump right in. My audience tends to be, I would say, skews toward women, but I do have men who listen in, and definitely high achieving. Burnout is such a topic of conversation. We did a book club on it a couple seasons ago, and oh my gosh. So I want to know from you as we kick off our conversation, what are some of the main challenges that you see high achievers having with their relationship with food?
I think that the relationship that I see, with food, and this is actually how my story and my focus actually evolved. If I can just take a quick step back, is, in my practice is pediatric based, right? As in my nutrition practice, I'm a registered dietitian. I was working with specifically kids, and especially during, the pandemic, I was working specifically with moms often, and just hearing again and again and again this underlying question that part of it was like, is it okay if I serve my kid chicken fingers? But the actual question was, can you please validate me and tell me that I'm not royally screwing up everything in my life? Because I'm so insecure about everything that I'm doing, and I feel like I'm not doing it right because Susie down the street is doing it better than me. So can you please tell me I'm not a royal screw up? Right?
Accurate. As the mom of a toddler, 5-year-old, that is very accurate feeling.
And yeah. And so, I was really hearing this again and again and again, and it really just became so apparent to me that whether we're talking about, women who are mothers or who are in a caregiving role and who do feed children, or women who are talking about their own relationships with food, there is this obsession with doing it right. There must be a right way to do this. And if only I can find what the right way is, everything is going to change in my life, right? If you look at any Special K diet commercial, There's always the person who's really sad before, everything is wrong in their life, and like suddenly they ate a bowl of Special K or whatever other food, the Atkins protein bars, and all of a sudden, like everything else in their life just magically fell into place. And so there's this focus really on doing it right that is such a contributor to the burnout that so many women are experiencing.
Yes. Okay. Uh-huh. I feel like I'm gonna get called out a lot in this episode, and
That
I
tends to
know,
happen.
yeah, and I've got some listeners that I'm already thinking of. I'm like, oh, you're gonna feel this one. You're and it's that perfectionism piece,
Yes.
right? Like when you are high achieving, and I would say specifically a high achieving female, I think it's
Yes,
very different for men who are
totally.
high achieving. But if you're a high achieving female, you're efficient. You want to make sure that everything is like in order. Like half your life is really controlling the outcome, right? To make
Yeah.
sure that you achieve. And the same thing happens with your kids and with your diet, whether it's your kids' diet or your own diet or the family's diet, like you get to a point where you're like, is this the right thing? Or that it's not the right thing, but
Mhm.
you're so burnt out, you're like, do not care. This is
Yeah.
just what we're doing
Yeah.
in order to get by. So, like, let's talk about that relationship with burnout. Like, what ends up happening? Because I know a lot of my clients, I know I've been there. When I was in a season of burnout, I felt like that was when my relationship with food was the absolute worst because I was using it as a coping mechanism. I didn't understand that at the time, but when I look back, I'm like, oh, absolutely, comfort food and
Yeah.
snacks, and how can I basically make myself feel better through food? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So I love that question. Number one, because when I talk about burnout, I'm running a program. I have my longer term program, which you mentioned, the Unapologetic Living Code, which is my 12-week program. I'm running a 4-week program starting this Wednesday called Good Enough on solely perfectionism. Because I say that there's 3 P's of burnout. There's perfectionism, there's people pleasing, and there's pressure that we allow to come in from society, family, ourselves that really burns women out. And I think that there is this idea that as you're saying, for women, it's different. For people who are socialized as women, it's different than it would be for a man. Like this perfectionism piece of it, this finding the right way, because women are never taught how to have their own backs, right? Like, what do you do when
Mm,
you fail? What do you do when you mess up? You beat up on yourself. You talk to yourself like you're a worthless human. You make yourself feel horrible enough in the hopes that that's going to motivate you, right? We don't have we're never taught the skills to have our own back. And so in the absence of being able to actually have our own back, to be like, okay, I failed. Now what? Especially in entrepreneurship, like, okay, I had a failed launch. Now what? Something didn't go my way. Now what? In motherhood, you're like, I tried to have the perfect day and my kid still threw a tantrum at 7 p.m. Like, what is happening? And when we don't know how to do that, it's important to learn what our protective mechanisms are, right? And so
mhm.
perfectionism is one of those because there is this thing of, okay, well, if I don't know how to protect myself, right? If you're not adept at martial arts, if you don't know how, like, how to protect yourself, the best thing you can do is put on some armor,
Right.
right? Is to protect your body with something externally. And so the perfectionism, again, like that obsession with doing things right can be that coat of armor when we don't know how to protect ourselves or in the absence of of having those skills. And also the reality is that for a lot of people and a lot of women specifically, what are the things that you actually allow yourself to do for yourself, right? When you're in that
Mm.
season of burnout, are you taking an hour-long bath every night? Are you going out for dinner with friends and having a glass of wine with them and relaxing? Are you taking a spa day? Like, what are these things? Are you allowing yourself to do any of those things? Because the likelihood is probably not. And so
Mm.
I think that, what I can say to women often, and as an intuitive eating dietitian, as somebody who believes that all foods fit, it's always important to look at in the context of why are we using food for comfort, right? And sometimes it's
Mm.
because that's the lowest order thing. Like the food is in the cupboard. Do you need to spend money on it? No, it's already there. Are you going out of your way? Do you need to get a babysitter? Do you need to call your partner to come and like stay with the kids while you go out somewhere? No, it's like so accessible, right? And so on
Mm,
one hand, I think we need to take some of that pressure off. And I've said this to people, until you have certain supports in place, even as a dietitian, I won't help you with your like let's not talk about the late night snacking, because that's not happening in a vacuum. Like, you don't have another coping mechanism. We can't take away a coping mechanism without introducing something else.
right.
And so, when we're looking at it, number one, it is recognizing, like, it's not just that you're a defective person who keeps on snacking at night for no reason. You're looking for something,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then, and this is what I work with women on as well, is how do we actually introduce the confidence and the capability to choose other things? Right?
Right.
To say, like, yeah, maybe I'm going to go on a walk every night, right? Like, I am going to ask my partner to make sure that they're home at 8 o'clock when the kids are in bed so I can go for a walk, right? Like, I'm going to inconvenience somebody else so that I can get some of my needs met, right? Because a lot
Yes.
of times that's why women are going to food. And again, there's lots of reasons, but it's also just like, that's the one where you don't really have to inconvenience anybody else. You don't have to ask for a babysitter. You don't have to go out and spend money. And so, like,
Mm.
there's so many great reasons why that happens.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm having one of those light bulb moments, which as a coach, even as a coach, when it's a
Totally.
different topic, you're like, oh, that explains so
Yeah.
much.
You're like, my life makes sense now.
My life makes sense. And that's what I'm feeling right now. As soon as you said that, it's like getting to the root of what it is. And so when externally it's like, oh yeah, it's burnout. Okay, but that's a really broad topic. You
Yeah.
could be burnt out by a lot of things. What is actually forcing your hand when it comes to food? And I love how you talked about all these different things, like, and you have to inconvenience somebody else in order to make it happen. Oh my gosh, I feel like that's going to be such a light bulb moment for a lot of people, because in coaching, whether it's, working with a dietitian, working with a burnout coach, working with a career coach, our goal is to get to the root of whatever
Yeah.
it is, and I know my listeners hear me talk about the realistic reality when it comes to like my coaching process, and that's exactly what it is. Let's get to the root of what's going on, what is actually true in the situation that you're in. And I think for people who have partners, I think this is so important in terms of communication, because I remember my husband, like most husbands, does not deal with weight, does not, he goes into the doctor and they're just like, oh, you're so healthy, you're so great. And I'm like, really? Are you? I don't know, but okay, that's fine. So he can eat and does eat basically whatever he wants. And it's been like that our entire relationship. No shade to him. He's amazing. Okay. He does all the cooking. Like he's amazing. But it got to a point where I was like, I can't eat like you. Like we cannot eat this way. And so I have had to inconvenience him. I have had to say, I can't eat this type of food, or I had a reaction to this, or I don't feel good after eating this type of meal. And so it's not something that I really want in the rotation. Like I have had to learn how to be really vocal about that so that it doesn't cause a domino effect for everything else.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you that has been life changing for us. Like we actually just this year, I don't know, was it this year? Yeah, it was this year. We started doing high protein breakfasts. We used to not hardly do anything for breakfast, which I think is really common. And we switched to high protein breakfast after we were doing this like whole fasting thing, which I hated and it was horrible. But if you fast, that's great. Good for you. I did not enjoy it. He was fine with it. I did not enjoy it. But we switched to high
That's pretty
protein
typical for men
breakfast.
and women.
Yeah. And because we were doing that, and I told him, I said, that is the one thing we need to keep, because my energy through the day was so much higher when I had high protein breakfast. And so we changed like our entire eating schedule so that we could have like a higher protein breakfast and all these different things. But it took that awareness for me, and then for me to communicate to him, because it was going to be an inconvenience because it changed our morning routine because he does all the cooking. So it's, oh my gosh, this is like light bulb moment. Like sometimes you have to inconvenience other people in order to
Yeah.
make it happen.
And it sucks because women are not typically the biggest fans of inconveniencing other people. We're like, we should be able to do it all and not ever ask anyone for help.
Right, right. I want to touch on something else too that you said, because you said you're an intuitive eating coach. And I really love that because I think sometimes from a social media perspective, we tend to follow people who speak in absolutes. And I
Mhm.
really want to say this because this is something very recently that I've been kind of vocal about in different spaces. But when you're following somebody who's talking about food or fitness, or really anything, even career development, and they talk in absolutes, you have to do this in order to get this result. You have to do this. Here are the top 3 things you have to do in order to do this. Anybody that is saying that immediately, I'm like, no. And I want to bring that up because I feel like diet and food becomes one of those things. You cannot feed your kids this. You shouldn't be eating this. Don't eat at this time. Don't eat at that time. Don't do this. Don't do that. Da, 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 da. Like all of these absolutes that people put into the world. But at the end of the day, it really is what works for you and what works for your body, what works for your schedule, right? Like all of that. Can you touch on that a little bit? I don't know if you've noticed that, but that's something that I've seen so much out there that I'm trying to get people to realize as they're following different people about different topics.
I think that it's a big problem in social media typically. Just I could, this is a hill that I will die on that. I mean, we see it politically, we see it in everything, like the divide, right? Everything is black and white. You're siloed in everything. And I think that especially in today's day and age, we've gone from a time where there was only diet culture messaging, right? If
Yes.
you are above a certain BMI or clothing size, you're inherently unhealthy. You need to lose weight. All of those messages. So now we still have a ton of that message. And we have a whole other side of the spectrum that is, the body positivity movement, which is like, if you ever want to change your body, if you ever want to lose half an ounce, you are a horrible person. Right. And
Mm,
I think that a lot of people, and I have, coaching clients, and I have dietetic clients, like, women who really feel caught between these two sides. And they're like, so I feel like I have mixed opinions of, I feel better when I'm a certain way, or when I'm a certain, like, when I don't feel as heavy, or when I eat a certain way, or when I don't eat this food. But also, what does that mean about me? Am I a horrible person? And exactly what you're saying, right? I think that we see these silos, and we feel like we either have to always fit into one camp or another. It's
mhm.
like, if I found this even as an entrepreneur in a totally different place, of people starting to talk about like feminine energies and masculine energies and this and like, either you're this or you're this, or either you're doing this, and we see so much of that, right? And
Yes.
so I think the reality is always just liking your reasons. And even in intuitive eating, which is a movement which is basically says, all foods are good foods. You can have lots of
Mhm.
different foods, and we need to get back to a place where we can trust our bodies, right? Not like look at a magazine in aisle 6 and be like, okay, well, I guess spaghetti squash is out today because they've said that
Mhm.
we can't eat it anymore, or whatever the latest fad diet is, right?
Mhm.
It's what feels good in your body and what works for you. And that's not a skill that we're often raised with, especially as women, especially as people who are raised by people who are spending time on like the cottage cheese diet and the cabbage soup diet and all of those things that the generations before us have seen. And that obsession with, like, again, like, it's this focus on, there must be a right way to look, to speak, to act, to like a certain right dress size, a certain right way to eat, all of those things that then lead us into burnout, when you're like, oh my God, how do I maintain all of these things? Especially for someone whose body maybe doesn't want to settle at
Mhm.
whatever the quote
Right.
unquote right weight is.
Right. Right. Oh my gosh. Yes. Okay. Oh, I have so many things to say. First of all, my husband growing up did the cabbage soup diet. And he talks about it,
I
comes up
love
randomly
cabbage
in
soup.
conversation, and
Oh my
it just
gosh.
cracks me up. So I have to show it. He did that. Well, and if you're a child of the 90s, then likely your parents at some point were part of some type of, health craze or fad or something like that. And I didn't realize until very recently how much that impacted my relationship with food, with exercising, with how I view myself, with my ability to stick with something, all of those things, like how you're raised and the environment that you're raised in, I think impacts, all of that so heavily. And now as parents, like I said, our son is 5.5 at the time of this recording. And I told my husband, I was like, we have to change the relationship with food that he has, because
Mhm.
I don't want him to be raised the same way that I was. And I don't want, because I'm a very picky eater for a lot of different reasons. And I got shamed for that. People made fun of me. Like, it's been such a thing. And I'm like, if he's like that, I don't want that to come from us at the very least. Like, we need to create kind of this healthier relationship with food. And one of the things that we do, and I don't even know if this is the right thing, but it feels like the right thing for us, like, because we want him to be able to have treats and things like that. And I'm like, look, like, eat your lunch, like, have like a good balanced lunch, and then have the sugary treat thing in moderation, right? Because my thing was like, have your belly full of good food, and then have the sugary thing to try to like offset those things. I have no idea if that's the right thing, but for me it was more teaching him, like, if you're going to eat something that's like pure sugar on an empty stomach, it's probably going to have a negative reaction. And so getting him to like pair those things together, but having to think in a new way for the betterment of my kid, that has
Mhm.
been so hard to like shift my own mindset and change from the way that I was raised and the way that I still think about food and fitness.
Totally. And I think that it's an evolution for most people, especially for those of us like who again were raised in the 80s, 90s, like who saw every fad diet, right? Like I remember seeing Atkins commercials when I was watching like TV as a 10-year-old. They were just like that was what was there. And so we've all seen it, we all know it. And I think that there's always again like that right way for people. There's we can look online of every single recommendation under the sun. And then
Mhm.
sometimes you have to take that step back and be like, does that actually fit with what I want to do? Right. And I say this to clients all the time, whether it's in my nutrition practice or in my coaching practice, is, here's best practices. Here's what I would say. But if you're telling me you're not going to do that, then let's take like 12 steps backwards and see where we can make progress here. Right. If I'm telling you to do something and you're like, okay, that's 100% not gonna work for me.
Mhm.
Fantastic. Like then let's regroup together, right? And
Right.
so the most important thing is that it feels good for you, right? I always say like, the most important
Right.
thing is that you understand your reasons. And so whether we're talking about feeding kids and that means working with a dietitian to actually understand what you're doing like on a
Mhm.
practical level, right? When I think I'm doing X by serving dessert, here's how it might come across because quite frankly, if for any moms and parents that are listening, a lot of our intuition when it comes to feeding our kids is not the greatest. Um, but like remembering where that comes from, right? Like we raised
Right.
kids in deserts, in as much as we possibly can get. We need to like conserve energy now so that if we don't eat for 6 days because we can't hunt something, here's how it is. Like things our animal brains haven't really evolved as much as we want to give them credit for. We're not really caught up to the
Mhm.
21st century. And so sometimes we actually need to again get to that root cause and understand that motivation, right? And for a
Right.
lot of women, even who are feeding kids, And I see this time and again, I ask all the time, my favorite question is why? And it's like, if your picky eater isn't eating what you're preparing for dinner, and they're like, I made 7 different meals in the hopes that my child would eat something. Why? And they're like, just because I love my child so much. Like, I'm just doing it for them. And the actual why is because I'm feeling really insecure in motherhood today. And if my child doesn't eat, it's once again going to reinforce the fact that I'm a failure. And so I just need them to eat something so that I
Right.
am okay. Right. And again,
Yes.
no shame on that. Like, we throw no shade on
Mhm.
parents who are having a hard time, but it is just really understanding what are we doing and why, right?
Right.
For
Right.
for children who even, parents might feel uncomfortable with how quickly they're growing, with what their bodies look like, with, for parents who are sometimes like, I don't want to serve some of these higher sugar, higher fat foods because I'm nervous that my child is going to grow faster. And what's that going to mean for them? Sometimes there's also a hint of, and what does that mean for me? Like, what are parents going to think about me as a parent
Right.
if this is what my child looks like? Right.
Right.
And again, like, that's something that parents need to work through without that necessarily meaning that they create changes for their child, but like
Right.
that's a real fear. That's a real struggle of people who were raised in the generations that we were. And like, we need to stop pretending that that's not something that we contend with. Myself included, as somebody who raised, I do this work. And also I was someone who was raised in the same, drink from the same water as everybody else.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I feel like this is going to be so good for parents, which wasn't like the intention for this, but I think it's so good to understand, even if you're not a parent, to understand where your thinking is around why you make the food choices that you make, or why you have the feelings that you do towards certain things. And I know, like, one of the things that started happening more recently with my son is like, he just won't want to eat lunch. We're like, hey, like, do you want lunch? And he's like, no. And we're like, okay. And it's been really hard to just be okay with that, and like we're trying to listen to him essentially, instead of forcing things, forcing him to do things, or forcing him to fit into some type of, mold or whatever. We're trying to listen to what he's saying. And I'm going to tell you, though, the first couple of times that he was like, I'm not hungry, I don't want to eat lunch, both my husband and I were like, no, like, I think you really need to eat something. Like, we really need to get some food into you. Like, we were really trying to convince him. And he's sitting there like, I am not hungry. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, and we're raising him to be vocal about his opinions and his thoughts and all of that. And so I look at my husband and I'm like, look, we are raising him to be this way. We can't raise him to be that way and then totally knock him down and
Isn't
tell him
it
he
so
can't be
hard?
that way.
When you're like, I'm raising my kids to like talk back to people, like, assert their independence and this and this. And then they talk back to you and you're like, no, 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 I didn't mean me. I meant
Right.
everybody else.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay. Along these same lines, because I like to equate everything back to career and work, because obviously
Yeah.
career podcast, right? So I'm thinking about this and I'm thinking, I'm somebody I'm busy. I'm a busy professional. I've got a lot going on. I'm in a lot of meetings. I've got a lot of things. And I'm trying to put together like the diet, or not diet, but the food plan that works best for me and the consistency. And I've been down this road. So I'm kind of speaking from my own experience of, you put together this food plan and you're trying to be really consistent with everything. And then you have a lunch meeting. And then you have, drinks after dinner, or you have to go to a dinner thing, or you have to go to this event, or you have to do this thing. And it almost feels like you shouldn't participate. You can't participate. Oh, I can't eat that. I can't go here. I can't do that. I can't do that. What I know there are listeners out there that feel that way when they get into a rhythm with eating. What is your advice? Because I know I have my advice when I've talked about this with clients. But what would you tell somebody in that particular position?
Oh my God, I have so many thoughts about this. Um, like, how many hours do you have? So, number one, I think that and I don't mean this harshly, But any plan that doesn't account for that is is just a diet that's going to fail, right? I think that sometimes
Thank you.
in our perfectionism, and again, like I coach on perfectionism, and the reality is we make these beautiful packaged plans in our brains where we're like, I'm suddenly going to wake up tomorrow and my life is going to be drastically different than it was today. And so magically, I'm going to like cook a 3-course breakfast that, with all of the fixing, and I'm going to garnish it beautifully, when literally every other day of my life, I've grabbed a protein bar on the way out of the house for, on the way to work, or I've skipped breakfast because I'm too busy. Right.
Mhm,
And so
mhm.
it just goes back to all of how we're so socialized, starting even from how we eat, right? Again, like this obsession with the right way. And think about any single diet, right? It's like if you mess up, you have to start all the way at day one again, right?
Right.
That's not the way that most things work. It's not like if you when you're in a relationship, if you like mentioned your husband, right? If you get in a fight with your husband, you're like, that's it, marriage canceled, start from day one,
Right.
right? We're starting all over again. Or like you forgot to load the dishwasher well, like canceled home ownership starting from day one, right? We don't function like that. And the problem is that when we think about that in food, and it is how we're socialized from diet culture, when we start thinking about that from food, like you messed up today, start from day one, that's how we think about everything. Think about again,
Mhm.
as in entrepreneurship, in our careers, like you messed up, sucks to be you start all the way from the beginning, right? And so again, it creates like this fear of failure. And so this perfectionism, like it stops people from even starting, because why am I going to start something that I'm just going to fail at when I know that I'm going to fail because my life is not going to change? So we think the perfectionism motivates us, and it's so demotivating, whether it's dietary, whether it's career wise, whether it's in starting a business or starting to train for a marathon, because you're always going to quote unquote fail at some point, right?
Yes.
And so, and the second thing is like just being super realistic about what's possible. Again, this perfectionism always comes in it has to be a beautifully prepared salad for lunch, right? It has to
Right.
be a perfect dinner, right? When the reality is 99% of the time there's a way to make whatever it is work,
Right.
right? I say to parents all the time, or busy professionals all the time, from a nutrition perspective, there isn't a whole lot of difference in eating a bowl of cereal with milk or with yogurt and some fruit to, chicken, rice, and broccoli. We just think about them differently as a dinner.
Mhm.
One, you'd have a lot of judgment about, right? This is the easy way out. I can't serve that to my kids. I'm really going to eat this for dinner. And the other, you're like, yeah, that's a meal.
Right.
But it doesn't really, from a nutrition standpoint, it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. It's just the judgment and the perfectionism that we put onto that. And so the reality
Mhm.
is that if this is part of your life, and I'm going a bit on my soapbox about this, but I like to think in what I call puzzle thinking, right? You're building a puzzle of your life. And what we do so often is we try and optimize one part of it without recognizing that all of a sudden, if we change that puzzle piece too much, it doesn't fit into the rest of it. So you can't all of a sudden just change your diet drastically without recognizing that other things have to shift around that. And so if you're looking at a diet where, again, some people who do intermittent fasting and they're like, it means that I stop eating at 6 p.m., but I have dinner parties after that for my career, for my work, or for whatever it is. Okay, well, are we going to change one or are we going to change the other? Or are we going to do one and recognize that sometimes that's not going to happen for the days, right? It's just
Right.
not a possibility. And so you either have to be prepared to shift all of the other puzzle pieces, or we have to say, this sounds really nice in theory, but it's actually not going to work in the full puzzle that is my life.
Mhm. Mhm. Oh my gosh. Okay, I love this. I feel like that is something that people have to hear and understand, especially my high achieving perfectionists out there, because what you're describing is exactly what I went through for so many years around dieting, around fitness as well. We talked about this on another episode. where I was trying to put this like absolute with fitness. I have to do 30 minutes a day and it has to look like this and it has to look like that. But I've got 3 days where I work all day in like makeup and all the things and whatever, and I don't want to work out. And so it was shifting my own mindset around what is going to shift in order to make this happen. And this is, oh my gosh, this is going to end up totally being a clip because it's so important to understand that. And I think we were raised with so many of the diet culture things being these absolutes. You have to do this for 30 days, do this for 90 days, do the, and so our mindset is like stuck in that. Oh my gosh, I
But
love
also we
that.
are raised in a time where fitness and nutrition had one sole purpose. It was just to change your body,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And in this day and age, when I think about fitness, it's a totally different thing, right? I have 3
Right.
kids. I have a 2.5-year-old who still loves being carried. He's like 25 pounds. I want to make sure that I can carry him around all day,
Mhm,
every day.
mhm.
And, or that when I'm loading the groceries in and out of the car, I'm not injuring myself, or that when I run after my kids, all of those things, right? It helps me with my mental health. It helps me with just, getting out energy that I have. And we're still operating a lot from that old paradigm,
Mhm.
right? And this is something that I do with clients all the time is start understanding what the paradigms and definitions that we're operating from are, and then what the ones we
Mm,
want to be operating from are. Because sometimes when you're like, I don't know why it feels like change is so hard, right? It's like you're
right.
being stuck in the mud and you're trying to turn a car. Like, because you're still stuck in the old stuff and you're trying to veer in a new direction. But that subconscious part of your brain is still operating from, well, if we're hoping to change our bodies, or if we're hoping to lose weight, or if we're hoping to, just like look a certain way, it does have to be this exercise in exactly this way, because that's what someone in the 90s
Mm,
promised me it would be.
mhm, mhm. Okay, I feel like this is the best segue into talking about our actions for this episode. One of the things that we're doing this season is making sure that every episode has 3 distinct actions. So regardless of what we've been talking about, which has been amazing, and I have so many more questions, but for the sake of time, I want to spend some time on the actions that we outlined for this episode. And the first one being shifting your perspective around getting it right. And we kind of mentioned that already, but can you kind of do another like summation of that for everyone and what they should focus on when it comes to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to outline actually one strategy that I use where it works, whether we're talking about burnout, whether we're talking about having no time, all the things that I hear from my clients, or it relates to the things that we are eating, right? I call it my what, why, what strategy. And so we just start with actually taking stock of like, what are you doing? Right? Sometimes we beat ourselves up in our own minds for things that we've never actually done. We're like, I'm a horrible person because and you're like, where in your day did you do that? Like, I don't see that. Right. And so just starting to understand, like, what are we actually doing? If it's food, like, what are you actually eating? When are the times that you're feeling either that you're feeling like, okay, I underate or I overate, or I'm feeling guilty about what I ate, all of those things, right? Just like getting really
Mhm.
honest about what it is without any judgment. If it's you feel like you have no time, like, what are you doing in your day that has you feeling like you have no time? Let's just take stock for like a day and see where you're spending your time. Then we get to come to the really fun part, which is starting to ask why. As I said, why is my favorite question, because we can't create changes. Sometimes we're really good, or we think we're really good at problem solving, and we are, but we're solving the wrong problem. And
Mm.
so when we start understanding, as I said, like, why are we doing something? If you're a busy professional and you're skipping meals the entire day because you're like, let me just power through lunchtime. And then by 9 p.m., you're like chin deep in a bag of chips that is like over your head for easier access. And you're
Right.
like, I don't understand why I'm doing this. Like, pick me, I do. Right. And so starting to understand the why are we doing these things? Because often it's not just I'm a horrible person, or I have no self-control, or I don't know, I keep on wasting time in my business. Right. There's
Mhm.
often a lot of intelligence that our bodies have, that our minds have, that we don't give enough credit to. And
Mm-hmm.
then the what strategy. So what are we getting out of any of the things that we're doing? If you're eating late at night and you don't want to be, and I want to just be really clear about the fact that I'm giving this example because I know it's something that a lot of people struggle with, this not wanting to, but there's nothing inherently wrong with eating at any time. So I'm not someone who's like, you have to stop eating at 6 p.m. So I just want to be really clear about that for anyone who's been in like a lot of diet culture spaces.
Yeah.
But, you know, what are you getting out of this? And if it makes you feel horrible to be eating at like 2 in the morning because you're like, I should be sleeping instead. Okay, but are you getting alone time that after a busy day and then going home to, kids at home that you just want like 5 minutes of peace and something to make you feel really warm and cozy and like that chocolate chip cookie does
Mm-hmm.
it? Because that's not a problem. It's not inherently a problem. It's not you're a horrible person problem. It's just, okay, so like, what are you getting out of that? And can we get you that somewhere else? Right? Can we think about new strategies? Can we introduce something else that might work better that doesn't have you feeling, a little bit great and a little bit horrible?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love that. That is going to be such a helpful strategy for so many people. And I will tell you too, so when I was pregnant, I got gestational diabetes. And for anybody out there that has had that, like you have to basically change your diet overnight,
Yeah.
which is what we had to do. And one of the things that they said for me, for where I was with my numbers, I had to eat before I went to bed. And I am going to tell you that was one of the hardest things for me to do because I grew up that you stop eating at like 7 o'clock, or there's like a threshold of time that you need to stop eating before bed and all of this. And then now I'm shifting into no, like you need to eat something before you go to bed because your blood sugar. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I think this comes down to what we were talking about earlier. You have to understand what's going on for your situation too, to know what's going to be best for your body and all of that. And so, yeah, oh my
Absolutely. And
gosh.
there's a lot of people who, it's pretty common. It's a common recommendation for, people with diabetes who have low blood sugars in the mornings or have high blood
Mhm.
sugars in the morning. Sorry. Um, and it's totally counter to everything that a lot of people have learned about nutrition. And I think that that's exactly as you're saying, like for every quote unquote rule, there's an exception, or there's someone that doesn't
Yeah.
fit for, or there's someone who like the best thing they could do is the direct opposite of that rule that they just learned.
Mhm.
And that's so hard for people who identify as high achievers, who are perfectionists, who are probably like you and me, who are like, I'm an A+ student. If you give me a
Rule
rule, if you give
follower.
me a yes, like if you give me a syllabus, like, I will follow it. I would just like
Mhm.
to can I do next year's courses? Like, and I'll just start on those, right? And and then we wonder why in things that don't necessarily have, you get an A+ today, why we're so
Mhm.
obsessed with finding the A pluses. And for people who struggle with diet, a lot of it is like gold star for me. I followed my diet today, or entrepreneurship, like I made a sale today, or gold star for me. And when you
Mhm.
don't get those things regularly and you have to rely back on your own internal gold stars, it can be a real challenge.
Yes. I feel like some people are gonna get called out in this episode. Oh man. All right, let's go on to action number 2, because this one I think is so important. And I feel like people don't think about doing this as much because there's so many like quick fix things that they get focused on. But talk to me about getting curious about patterns.
Yeah. So what we do often is go straight to condemnation. I say we have to foster curiosity without condemnation, right? Ugh, why did I do that again? I'm so stupid. Oh my God, I know better, right? Whether it's
Mhm.
you get caught in hustle again in your business, whether it's just perfectionism, like you let someone override a boundary, like you told someone you were gonna bring out your kid at 10 p.m. when you were like, I know they need to go to bed at 7, like 7:30, right? But it was your mother-in-law and she guilted you and all the things. Or it's about diet, right? When you're like, oh, I know that this doesn't make me feel good, right? Dairy doesn't make me feel good, but I ate it, or whatever it is. And right away, we go straight to condemnation, right? We're like, I'm just horrible. And the reality is that we always learn in retrospect. All humans learn in retrospect. You do something, you mess it up, you kind of
Mm-hmm.
learn, you mess it up again, you go in, and eventually you start learning in retrospect. You're like, huh, I did that thing again. Interesting, right? But when we go straight to condemnation, we block any of that learning.
Mm.
We've already made the decision. I'm just horrible. There's nowhere to go from here. It just
Right.
is what it is, right? And so instead, what we need to start fostering is really just getting curious about, okay, like, why did I do that thing again? Even if we learn in retrospect, right? I'm celiac, so I can't have gluten. And a lot of times when I got diagnosed and I was like 16 or 17. So it's been like 15 years now. So now it's a non-issue. But I remember a ton of times in the beginning where I ended up eating gluten because
Mm.
I wasn't prepared, right? I didn't eat before the party, or I was hungry, or I relied on like something that someone didn't understand, and then I got starving and was an irresponsible teenager and ate that food, right? And so there's either you can say like, okay, I'm horrible, or you can say, okay, so how can we plan better for next time, right?
Right.
And just being able to acknowledge that we learn in retrospect allows us to get curious about like, why do we keep on doing this thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so when we are doing this thing, then I'm trying to then proactively figure out a better way. And curiosity can be really hard when you've continuously been taught, like, nope, we beat ourselves up for failure, right? It's not something that we typically
Yes.
do, but just asking that question, why, again, like, why do I think that I did that, can be
Mm-hmm.
really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh. Okay. I think this is, again, another really helpful strategy for people to understand their own patterns and their own behavior. I feel like that's such a barrier, especially if you're stuck in burnout. Like if you're in the middle of it, it's so hard to step out and see the behaviors, or you've been able to justify things somehow in your head. And it's wild what we will do to justify certain decisions and choices. Like I remember like at the height of my burnout when I was in a full-time career, and I would sit there with a Reese's peanut butter cup on my, on my desk, and I'm like, I know that this is not the best choice for me, but I am going to make it anyway because I had a really awful day and this is going to give me at least 30 seconds of joy and I feel really good.
And so
you know?
but that's a really important point, right? Is when we're making decisions, and I feel like this is, point number 3 that I really wanted to make, is just being able to own them,
Yes.
right? Like, even if I think that we have this obsession with, and I think it's like, a Maya Angelou quote that is like, when you know better, you do better. And you're like,
Mhm.
yes, sometimes, and obviously in certain places, you should definitely do better, right? If like in like racism, anti-Semitism, all those things, you should do better when you know better. Let's just
Yes.
clarify that. But like certain things, it's like when I know better, I'm gonna do better. I'm lactose intolerant. Like I'm an Eastern European Jew. We don't do well with dairy, right? So in some ways, I can say when I know better, when I know that about myself, I should
Mhm.
make a better choice, right? But sometimes also not. Like sometimes you can just own the fact that like I'm gonna eat some ice cream. My stomach is not gonna be happy, but I love ice
Mhm.
cream, and so I'm gonna do it anyway,
Yes.
right? And it really is that, just like that, not beating yourself up of, if I'm making this choice, I'm obviously a delinquent,
Right.
right? What
Right.
adult hurts their stomach intentionally, right? And so we have this like real focus on, we have to do it perfectly. If you've identified a food trigger, if you have decided you're doing something, like you obviously have to do it 100% of the time, and like you just don't.
Right. Right. Oh my gosh. So I'm lactose intolerant also. And very recently, probably in the last like 3 years, figured that out. And we shifted so much of our diet. And I was like, oh my God, I think so much of my issues in like my 30s, but probably my 20s too, was dairy, because I love dairy so much. And when we pulled a lot of it out of our diet, I was like, oh my God, I feel so much better today. And I had no idea because, we're cheese and ice cream and milk and all of this. And it's just once you become aware of it, you make such different choices. And once you're aware of how your body is processing food, that has been to me like the biggest learning and the best learning is the awareness of what I'm eating and how I'm feeling after, when I know it's not stress related. Like there was a period
Yeah.
where I was like, I know this is stress and I get that, but now I don't have that. And so if a food like impacts me negatively, I will go to Danny, because again, he does all the cooking, all the food. I know I'm very blessed in that way. It's just the way we have it set up.
To me,
I
my
will
husband walks into the kitchen and I'm like, get out.
Oh no. Yeah, he's like, I don't want you anywhere near my kitchen. I'm like, perfect, great, happy to not be there. Um, but I will tell him like, I don't know what it was, but something I ate in this meal did not go
Agree with you. Yeah.
well for me, and so then we'll talk about it. We'll talk about the meal and he'll tell me like, okay, well, we had this and we had that, and usually we can figure out what it is, but talk about, you have to have awareness. You have to be able to communicate that to whoever is doing the cooking. And then you have to be committed to figuring that out. And, all of these pieces that I think my husband and I in the last like handful of years, COVID really is what was a catalyst for a lot of this, but it has helped so much in everybody feeling better,
Totally.
to the
And I
point where
think
I can
that's
be like,
true.
I hate this texture,
Yeah.
tastes good, hate the texture. And he's like, okay, so, how can we change that up? And that has been such a game changer for us.
Totally. But I think that's true. What you sort of said, like it's hard when you're continuously eating a food and you don't notice that it's negatively impacting you, right? I think that's so true about even how we think about burnout, right? Like we're
Mhm.
so swim in the water of hustle culture and just like go, 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 go. And if you, especially as women and mothers in particular, it's like if you feel like a doormat, at the end of the day, you're doing it right. If you feel like crap all the time, it means you're doing a good job in everything you're doing, right? That it's really hard sometimes even for people to recognize like, oh, I need to make a change
Right.
because you're like, I feel horrible, but it's not so bad. It's not terrible. And then sometimes like, 2 years out, or I have clients who even do my 12-week program and they're like, oh, I don't know how I was living like that.
Right. Yeah. Danny and I say that all the time, all the time. We're like, how did we live this way? How did we function like that? Like the awareness. And honestly, this is the real catalyst for this season of like helping people become aware of some of these things that are impacting specifically career, because obviously that's what I talk about, but just their life in general. And I think it's so, so important. Oh my gosh. I want to make sure that you did mention it, but action number 3 is setting yourself up for success. I feel like we've talked about that a lot, but can you kind of hone in for everyone? Like, what does that look like and how can they start doing that for themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. So it really is, very boring. Like it's not a fancy kind of thing that we're doing, but it is just taking stock of your day and seeing how you can set yourself up for success, right? If you're thinking about from a nutrition perspective, is that lowering your standards even on busy days? Like is breakfast going to be a
Mhm.
protein bar and, an individual yogurt on the way out of the house because you're running to work on a day that you have to go there really early? Is it going to be a sandwich with some, lettuce inside as your vegetables? Like are we going to lower our standards a little bit, make it a little bit easier for us?
Mhm.
Or are we actually just going to recognize that sometimes we're self-sabotaging, right? Like we're
Yes.
putting ourselves in that situation where we're like, I failed here 10,000 times. But maybe if I
Mhm.
do it exactly the same on the 10,001th, somehow it'll just work itself out, right? And if your audience, is in entrepreneurship, like we do this sometimes also, we're like, I've had a failed launch 100 times, but I'm gonna try exactly this, just another time, just to see what happens, right? And like, lo and
Right.
behold, it ends up the same way, right? Or, we're doing that in our diet as well. So if you're skipping meals the entire day and then we're eating a ton at night or feeling out of control with food at night,
Hmm.
okay, so can we do anything earlier in the day, right?
Right.
It's just starting to get curious about um those things that we can change and recognizing that even, I'm 32, right? I'm in my adult life, and even so, I have so much more of my life to go in fostering these food relationships, right? We like to think about
Mhm.
every single meal and every single snack as it's do or die, right? You either get this one
Yes.
right or all like hope is lost. And again, like that's one of the ways that our food relationships and diet culture
Right.
even influences our entrepreneurship journeys, because how do most
Mhm.
people think about every launch or every sales call they have? If you ruin
Mhm.
this one, it's all over for you for the rest of your life. That's it. Close up shop. We're done. Right. And
Yes.
so it's just shifting from that, just getting curious, and then how can I set myself up for success? Sometimes you're going to set yourself up and you're like, "Hey, that still didn't work. I
Right.
still did that thing." Right?
Right.
Okay, so how do we continue troubleshooting to find what works for us? And whether that's doing that with a coach, a dietitian, a professional, or doing that on your own, just continuing to recognize like we need to just set ourselves up for success very often.
Yes. Yes. Okay. I want to add to that because I feel like we have these messages in our head, and especially for me, so I turned 40 this year, and I don't know what it is about turning 40, but like this light bulb came on for me of why do I think the way that I do. We kind of mentioned that earlier in the episode. And food was such a big trigger for me around that, where I had this like, oh, I don't like this vegetable. I don't like this thing. I don't like this thing. And as a picky eater, that has been a truth for me for a very, very long time. And I finally got to a point, and this is specifically with vegetables. So anybody that's like anti-vegetable, this was the process I had to go through to figure out the reality of it for me. Um, was it needed to be cooked a certain way, and I needed to figure out the taste of it. And so I'm going to use broccoli because I feel like this is kind of the joke in our household now, but I do not like broccoli unless it is like cold crisp and dipped in ranch, or if it's cooked. I don't know all the terminology for it because I don't actually cook it, but basically like blanching it,
Yeah.
so that it's not mushy. Like it cannot, if it's mushy, will not touch it. And it cannot smell like broccoli because I can't handle the smell of it. And so my husband, I ate this broccoli when we went out to eat somewhere. I don't even remember where it was. And I loved it. Like it tasted so good. And I told him, I said, if you want me to eat broccoli, you have to cook it like this every single time, and I will eat it. And I am going to tell you, we were out with our friends who knew how to cook it that way, and they taught him how to cook it. And then he went and like watched videos on it, and he taught himself how to cook broccoli this way that I liked it because I would eat it. And it was this light bulb moment for us where we were like, do we actually not like the thing, or are we not taking the time to figure out the version of it that we do like, that we are willing to eat? Are there certain instances that it needs to be cooked in and all of that? And I know that's a really specific example, but it changed my mindset around how I viewed certain foods. So when you're talking about setting yourself up for success, unpacking those things that you feel, oh, I don't like this. Well, why don't you like it? Like what is the thing about it? Because if it's the taste, we can change the taste. If it's the texture, in most cases, you can change the texture. And so what is that? And I feel like my relationship with food has shifted so much when I came to that understanding that maybe I just need to figure out the best way to cook it instead of the one way it's been presented to me my entire life up to this point.
And also, kid, like my daughter last night was like, "Why did you put rice on my plate, mommy? You know that I don't like rice." And we say all the time, because, you know, you're 6. Maybe one day you will like rice, right?
Right.
It's all of these absolutes that we still think like either I like it or I don't. Either I like things like this or
Yes.
I don't. And the reality is like you could change 10,000 times in your lifetime.
Right. Right. Oh my gosh. Okay. Ahuva, this has been such a good conversation. I loved this so much. And I think this is going to be so helpful for people that are really struggling with not just their relationship with food, but their perfectionist mentality, the burnout, and just how we view how those things trickle into other parts of our life. It just blows my mind every time I have somebody on and we kind of figure out all of these crazy connections. But where can people connect with you? Where can they find you?
So I hang out a lot on Instagram. My handle is Ahuva Hershkop. And I run a free community on Facebook called Beyond Burnout with Ahuva Hershkop. So you can find me in both of those places if you want to just learn more, hang out, find out more about my 12-week program. I'd love to see you, all of you guys there.
Amazing. And I will put links to all of those in the show notes or the blog post for this episode. Ahuva, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time and having this amazing discussion with me.
Thank you so much for having me.